So Pat, thank you for joining us again today. And how we'd like to start is to have you tell us your name, where you were born, what year you were born, and more importantly, when you first came to Redondo Beach. And when you came here, we've tried to frame all of our discussion about living, working, and playing here. And I know you started here as, we've talked before, and you started here as a parent and mother, and then began working with the city and with PTA, and name all the charitable organizations that are probably in the city. So if you could start with telling us your name, when you were born, and when you came to Redondo Beach.
Okay. I'm Patricia Allen Dreisler. I was born in Independence, Missouri in 1926, and I lived there until I went to college at the University of Kansas. My mom and dad lived through the Depression, so some of my values come from those years. I have one sister who's still living, and I had probably an idyllic life when I was growing up as a child, but who knew? I mean, it was tough times, but I always had pretty dresses and pretty ribbons, and shiny shoes, and all the things that make little girls happy. So then, through the years, I wanted to go to college in the worst way, but there really wasn't a lot of money to do that. And finally, my family realized that that was a dream of mine, so I went to the University of Kansas, lived in a co-op, which at the time was just beginning to be popular. I didn't know it was the beginning of a movement until 50 years later when somebody told me it was. Met my husband there. He was from New York State and in the Navy in the V12 program. And so we got married after having known each other just about 6 months. And in another year we moved to New Kensington, Pennsylvania, which was a real culture shock from somebody in the middle of the Midwest. And there were men on the front porches because they worked shift work, and I hadn't heard of that. There were miners, there were labor unions, there were gangsters living next door and across the street, and I was in awe and scared to death, frankly. So it wasn't, we lived there 3 years and had a wonderful time, had wonderful friends, so my fears were for naught. We moved then to Fort Wayne, Indiana, and, well, I had my oldest son in Pennsylvania, moved to Fort Wayne and had Gail and Carl, and then wended our way out here because opportunities in the Midwest weren't nearly as fine as on the coast. So came out, worked for Ramo Wooldridge first, and then, of course, it grew and grew and grew into TRW and then aerospace. I was a mom at home, and I loved it, but I had always been a volunteer from the time I was 10, so volunteering wasn't anything new to me. It was second nature. So I found some friends who suddenly came to me. It was Claudia and Al Lukes, and they sort of put me in the swim, and from there I volunteered for almost everything in sight and became a member of the Redondo Beach Dianas, they were raising funds at the time for all sorts of things, including traps for the rats under the pier, because there were no external funds to do those things, and it certainly couldn't come out of general fund monies. So I've forgotten what we did to do it. We probably had bake sales and all the usual things you did in the 50s. So from there, someone said, "Oh, would you like to work with the youth canteen?" And I thought, well, that sounded fun, even though my kids were younger. Why, that sounded like a good thing to do. So the youth canteen was a major part of my life for a few years, and a lot of my friends came from working there. In fact, at the 100th birthday of the high school, it was so fun to see Bob Dean, who had worked with me then. And so seeing old friends is the most rewarding thing that I have now.
So if I could go back a little
okay.
bit. you met your husband, and at some point you came from Fort Wayne,
Indiana. Mm-hmm.
What was he doing in Indiana at the time? I think you told us he was working for electronics.
He worked for Magnavox.
And then he was called out here. How did he come to meet the person that started TRW?
Oh, well, he didn't have too much possibility of rising through the ranks because everybody was kind of the same age in that era. They'd all, graduated from college after they got out of the war, and so it was like there's no upward mobility, so we've got to change places. And his best friend, who was our best man, was working out here at Ramo Wooldridge, and so he told Bob, come on out. So then we did.
So when he first got here, what kinds of things was he working on in Redondo Beach with Ramo?
Oh, it was in Inglewood. The plant was in Inglewood at the time. And he's a cost accountant, so he was in accounting all that time.
Now, you told us, I think once before, you talked with me about the car that you came out in.
Oh, we came out in well, let's see, it was a 1955 Ford station wagon that I had the privilege of ordering especially, and it was black and white with red upholstery. So it was pretty snazzy. We had that for a very long time. When we sold it to one of the guys that worked in Parks and Rec, one of the gardeners. I think they called them gardeners at that time. And so he took it, and then he made it into a truck. So that poor little 55 Ford lived forever. It may still be around somewhere.
So you came out from Fort Wayne, Indiana, with how many children?
With 3.
Okay, so when you got here, where did you first stay?
Well, we stayed in a motel up on Imperial. It was called the Sands, and we were in this motel, and it was really kind of degraded, I guess you'd say, living in that small space with 3 little kids. And then I would take my husband to work every day, and I would go look for property and hopefully find a house that we could afford and that we liked. And so we drew a line with a circumference no farther than we would move away from his work. So I searched all of that. We came down toward the South Bay one day and found a realtor out of the Robert Burns company, and they took us around, showed us a place in Playa del Rey, one in Torrance by El Retiro Park, and one on Avenue F. Well, I fell in love with it, and even though it was huge compared to the house that we'd moved out of in Fort Wayne. But we felt really lucky because we had cash from that home. We also looked at one in PV. That was $40,000 at the time. No way could we afford that. So because we had $14,000 cash, and we thought we could make it. Didn't want to live near the ocean, didn't want an old house, didn't want a Spanish style house. But that's what we got. And the owner was just so generous. He looked at us with our 3 little kids and said, if you want to buy this house, I will see that you can live here until the escrow closes. We've checked your references, and I think it would be okay. So fortunately, out of the motel, we moved in with our 3 little kids. No furniture yet. The furniture was on the way because it happened pretty quickly.
Now, what was the address of that house?
217 Avenue F, and it was owned by Sidney Welch, who was president of American Savings and Loan at the time.
And how much did that house cost, and what year was that?
It was 1956, and it was $24,000.
So now we're almost in 2006, and how much do you think that house is worth today?
Oh, I've been told lots of things, but it just blows me away because it's exactly the same house I moved into. So it's just...
So it's probably over $1 million.
I think it's $1 million plus.
So when you came out and you moved to Redondo Beach, what were the first schools that you sent your children to?
Well, South School, which is now the Community Resources Recreation Department.
At Nob Hill and
At
Pacific
Nob Hill at Pacific Coast Highway. And the interesting story about that is that that's where I ended up when I retired as the director of the department in that school. So my circle was really quite interesting. But that school didn't have a 5th or 6th grade, so my oldest son, Bob, was going to go to Toledo. But just before September, they opened a couple more classrooms. So all 6 children went to South School or Patterson School, or now the Community Resource Center. And they could walk to school. Everybody knew them on the way there, on the way back. The moms would stand out until all of the little kids that she knew, that her kids knew, had gone by, and then she would go in the house. And it just went that way all the way down the block. So you felt very safe. Well, you didn't think to not feel safe is the difference, I guess.
Now, that would be about, you said 1956?
56, my oldest son was in the 3rd grade.
So when we talk to a lot of people, they talk about life south of Nob Hill and life north of Nob Hill. And how many houses, were all the houses in place that are there now on the avenues, or was it a little bit different?
No, it's a little bit different. There were a lot of just beach cottages. There weren't the big houses. In fact, our house was a 2-story house, and it was one of the few 2 stories. On Avenue F, there was one across the street and down a little bit. The rest were just the cottage type. And all along the avenues, they were still that. And on the east side of the highway, Pacific Coast Highway, there was hardly anything. And the children used to go up there to fly kites because it was just wide open spaces and little hills of sand and dirt. So when kite season came along, everybody south went to fly kites up there.
Now, when you say there was nothing there, we've heard things that now were there dumps, and who owned that property, and how could they go up on the property and play there?
Nobody asked. They just went. I mean, it wasn't like this is mine and that's yours and the fences are here. It was just big empty lots,
now,
undeveloped.
When we ask people about, it's interesting that in 2005 you ask people where do you go out to eat, and they always have restaurants that they go to. When we asked people in 1956, where did you go to, people said they didn't. Can you tell us a little bit about in 2005 today, there's a lot of talk about the Millie Riera sign and preserving it. In 1956, where would you go for dinner, or if you went out to do something as a young family, what did you do for fun?
You went to friends. You didn't go to a restaurant, and heaven knows I only had 3 then, so that wasn't so bad. But you didn't go to a restaurant. You might go someplace where they serve spaghetti, because that's something you can divide up and serve to several children. Or you went someplace for ice cream and hot dogs. But there were no restaurants that you afforded to go. And you just went over to friends, and it was almost always potluck and a barbecue.
So when you went out for ice cream and a hot dog, where would you go in Redondo Beach? Do you remember any of those places?
Not really.
Well, did you ever take the kids to the pier?
Not much. We just went to the beach.
What was the beach?
The pier wasn't the place that we would go. About the farthest we go would be to Disneyland or Knott's Berry Farm, and that was a real occasion. But for most of the entertainment, it was the beach. And I'd take the kids down during summertime about 9:30 and stay till 2. And come home and nap the ones that were sleepy. And I would read. I read more books when I was at the beach than any other place. But we'd take food like bananas that couldn't get sandy before we ate them, and sandwiches, or we'd run home.
So when you went to the beach, was the beach any different then than it is now?
I don't go to the beach now.
Well, in terms of
I think it was just... Again, there were fewer houses between my house and the beach. There was less structure on the beach. There were lifeguard stations, but that was about it. There weren't existing volleyball poles for nets to be put up later. Weren't restrooms of the nature that we know now. No bike path. It was just sand, and it was wonderful. And I never thought of it as not being clean. And that the lifeguard people would come by dragging it first thing in the morning, and then it was ours.
So when your children, they first attended South School, and I would presume that at some point they moved on to middle school and high school. As they grew older, did you become more involved in the school activities?
I was always a member of the PTA, but doing a number of things that everybody does, I think, now, but more simply. There were room mothers, and we could bake cupcakes and cookies at home and take them to school. Now you almost can't do those kind of things. I'm sure that all of mine survived beautifully on homemade cupcakes and cookies. Art projects, but that was a time when there were not parents in the schoolroom. I mean, now, and once they had team teaching, and once they had aides, and then they had volunteers, it was a whole new world in the classroom. But in that time, the parents went to conference, and they loved their kids and took care of them when they got home, but they didn't go help them learn in school. I think somewhere we got the lines fuzzy after that as to who was responsible. So.
Now, one of the things that we hear about, I think for every parent and for every child that goes to school, there's memorable teachers. Were there any memorable teachers that your students had? We keep hearing about Mrs. Dept.
Mrs. Dept was the kindergarten teacher, and she was a sweet little lady, and she just charmed those children. You walked into Mrs. Dept's class, you sat on the rug, and you didn't speak until you were spoken to. And she was kind of a legend, and one of the legends was Halloween. She always had animated Halloween noises and extra pumpkins and witches and ghosts. I didn't ever see them, but my kids told me about them. She was wonderful. And then Mr. Lehrman was the other magic teacher that my kids had. 5 of the 6 had Mr. Lehrman. And he was a great motivator. You know, had little mini Toastmasters groups in the classrooms and taught them in real terms how to buy and sell stocks on paper. So all of his teaching was very practical and very meaningful as far as the youngsters were concerned. And there are several others that South School must have had more than its share of really interesting teachers who were also characters. The other teacher that I think was very special was Wally Nash. And he was at Toledo, and he was at Adams, and he was all over the place. And the administration always wanted him to be an administrator, and he says, no, I didn't learn to teach to be an administrator. I like the children. And he could teach every subject there was by teaching photography. Mm-hmm. Everything from physics to math to perspective to art. And he's kind of was a person who made you think about what you said. Not only what you said, but why you said it and what the ramifications would be. I'm not sure anybody does that now.
One of the things that people find it hard to believe, you've just told us about that east of Pacific Coast Highway on the avenues was all undeveloped. Can you tell us a little bit about where a young family had to go to buy clothes and buy food and the stores that were here in Redondo Beach and outside of Redondo Beach that you went to back then?
Well, there was a little frontier market up on the corner from us across Avenue F on Pacific Coast Highway. And I would send the children to the grocery store to buy small things, bread, milk, things they could carry, and give them enough money that they had to have change to account for when they got home. But they could walk across Pacific Coast Highway after looking both ways. So it wasn't like waiting for a light. And those are things that I remember and wish every child had an opportunity to do.
Now, can you describe some of the streets here in the South? We've heard that Prospect didn't go all the way through, that there was actually Toledo Street, which is how the school took its name, that there was a bridge where the red car. Do you have any remembrances when you first got here of the red car?
No, red car wasn't here in 56.
And what about the streets? Do you remember undeveloped parts of the city in the South End?
Well, I only had the car on Thursdays. So if I had the car on Thursdays and I had a babysitter, which was a luxury, I would go clear away from Redondo Beach. So it was an adventure to have a car for the daytime. So driving the streets, I think I was just a ride-along. So, and I think that some people like me then, things didn't relate to each other until much later.
So where would you go when you went on Thursdays? Where would you go to get away from Redondo Beach?
I'd go to Pasadena and the Huntington Library and up the coast, and for a long time I would get lost every time I had the car out, if I was downtown or anywhere near a freeway. But I knew in the afternoon, if I was headed west, I'd eventually come to the ocean. Then I knew I had to turn left. Because in the beginning it was really hard. You'd get on Jefferson Boulevard or you'd get on Sepulveda going south, and you didn't know that. So it was kind of pick and choose, and there wasn't that much traffic. And I remember a friend of mine coming out from Fort Wayne and visiting in Glendale, and she didn't have any way to get to me, and I went to get her before freeways. And it took me 2.5 hours to get there, and then it was just time to have lunch and turn around and take her back. So, and I was unfamiliar. I'm sure there must have been a shorter way, but.
Now, do you remember what gas cost at the time?
I think I have kept some of the gas that I bought for the kids, and I think at last note it was 37 cents. So they were driving; the younger ones were driving, and it was 37 cents. So I thought it was terrible to still be buying gas for my kids, until I look back at it now and I thought, "Gee, I'm sure glad I did."
In about what year did you start working? You said you had the opportunity to stay home as a working mother, and then at some point you decided to go to work. And I think in the 50s that would have been an unusual thing to do. And where did you start working, and what did you do?
Well, I worked on the playgrounds for Recreation and Parks Department because I had been that volunteer with the youth canteen, so I guess they felt I was reliable. And I had some skills and Jeff Abbey hired me. So I had some skills that were recognizable that would be good for the recreation department, and I was somewhat artistic. So I was hired. I worked at Toledo, and I worked at South School doing copper enameling on jewelry. I don't know whether they still do that or not. And again, Wally Nash was one of the mentors for me, teaching me all those things because he could do anything. And I think I made 70 cents an hour. And then I went up from there. You can't hardly go down.
And what year was that?
This was in 1957, 58, because I was pregnant part of the time when I was doing that.
Now, you're saying you worked at the schools, but you worked for the recreation department.
Right.
How did that work?
That was, there was a wonderful playground program, and it was part of community funding that was still part of general funds, but there was also this community service funding. And there were playground leaders on every school ground. And if you've talked to Ty Caravas, you know that he was one of those. And Wally was one of those. And we hired some of the school teachers whose salary weren't that great at the time to also serve as leaders on the school grounds. And they ran basketball programs and flag football and arts and crafts and caroms and ran tournaments. And so for 2.5 hours after school every day, the children were very well taken care of and at no fee. The only thing was in the summertime, you had to pay for making lanyards or pot holders or all those wonderful things you took home to Mom, and she still cherishes them. So I started working when I had these other little kids, and I thought, if anything ever happens, I need to refresh a skill. And my mother always said, Patty, learn typing and shorthand, because you can always be a secretary. And so I did that for a while, too, with the recreation department. When I was pregnant with my youngest daughter, I hired a babysitter who saved my life and was that third generation for the kids. And it was Emma Wiltz, and she was the widow of one of the first fire chiefs in the city. And his picture, Earl, is in the archives of the fire department. I was blessed with that. She was working at the Women's Club doing dishes after the Women's Club meetings, and somebody said, Pat Dreisler needs a babysitter, because I had Locke, Robin, and Sarah. I hadn't had Sarah yet. The little boys were still just babies. So she came along and really was a blessing. She'd been a short order cook in Hermosa, so anything those kids wanted to eat, she'd fix it for them. If it was 6 different meals, she'd fix 6 different meals. So I am forever grateful to that woman.
So how much would it cost to hire someone like that at the time?
I hate to say, it was about $5 a week. And I always tried to give her a little bit more because I couldn't believe that she was doing it for that. Then it went up gradually, and I could pay her $50 a week. But even at that, just believe it, she was worth everything.
Now, can you tell me a little bit about the canteen? What years were you involved with the canteen?
Well, when I first came to town, that was when I was sort of swooped up and made a volunteer and joined the Dianas, was on the youth committee, and that was a fun thing to be. It was in the old cafeteria of the old high school, so it was, nobody was using it. The Recreation Parks Department ran it. It was for the high school kids at the time. And it was very well done, and I think I mentioned once before that it was probably one of the first leadership development opportunities that young people had, because Janet Huffman, Bob Dean, some of the people who were with the department at that time, Don Watkins, we made it a small business. They bought their own food to sell, they bought candy bars, they bought everything that was being used to sell at the snack bar, and they were accountable for every dime and every penny, and stayed at the canteen until the books matched, till they balanced.
Can you tell us where the canteen was?
It's where the, I don't even know what to call it anymore. It's school district property, and some of the police offices are still there, as I recall, and also the Chamber of Commerce. So it was right about there, and near the old auditorium.
So it was around the corner of Vincent and Pacific Coast Highway, off of Pacific Coast Highway.
Yeah.
And what are the types of things that happened at the canteen in terms of entertainment?
Mostly dancing, and there were big bands. I was more interested in the administration and seeing that kids were okay than I was the entertainment, because they had hired the entertainment, or there was a disc jockey, or there were just records played. I mean, even that elementary. And the kids planned it, they decorated it, sometimes took all day on Friday. People off campus would come over in their extra hours and decorate, and of course 15 minutes after it was decorated, why, it was limp, because it was a basement area. And so it just got soggy, but it looked pretty.
So how old were you about that time?
Oh, that's 58, so I was 32.
So you may have been too old at the time to remember this, but we've heard about the difference between the canteen and the Bel Alr Club.
Oh, yes.
Can you tell us a little bit about the rivalry there of entertaining students?
Well, the canteen was really pre-drugs, pre-alcohol with teens. And really the ones who had learned to drive, they would come, but they didn't stay long, because they'd check in and say they were at the canteen, and I don't know where they went. But as time grew, the Bel Alr Club came in, and it was over, everything I can remember is already gone, by the Strand Theater, which is now two big houses. And it was the old Lynch, the old Lynch Motor Company business. And it was started by one of the supervisor's aides. And it was very different from the canteen. It was more commercial. They even had a smoking area. And I can remember Lillian Lord, and she was with the police then, and she was volunteering as a chaperone, and we were standing along this catwalk, and it was the years when the girls had hair that was like this. And there was smoke, and we were standing there just absolutely cringing for fear one of those sprayed hairdos would catch on fire. But we made it, but the competition was you could smoke, and it was a little more racy, and it was a little more commercial, so the canteen died.
So you went to, it's funny that you say this was a private business.
Right.
But did they have chaperones at the private business?
A few conscientious parents who thought they should be there.
Now, were they hired, or did they just went?
No, those were volunteers, but the police and some of the staff people with the city were there, and they were hired. And as I say, it was always just packed. I think, of course, from my point of view, the canteen was much lighter, softer, more an in training, an in training kind of thing. And you had the prince and princess of whatever event it was, and you had luau parties, and you had, a very special kind of camaraderie, in which most of the kids had a part in planning it, and the rest of them just had a good time. And the police were very important at the canteen in a different way than at the not the Revel Air, but the Bel Air, because it was Jack Renke, Mancinas, Kavanaugh, and they were all well known by the kids, and the kids knew them, and the kids knew their parents, and knew their brothers and sisters, and who might be liable to be in some small gang out in the North Redondo area at the time. So everyone knew everybody, and if one of those guys could call a kid by name, that snapped him up right then and there. Well, I'll talk to your dad tomorrow when I'm at the car wash or whatever it might be. And it really instilled some respect. And I'll never forget how well that worked. It was a different kind of chaperoning. But we had about 10 chaperones every night there was a dance. Then the kids at the intermediate schools wanted canteens. So we did that too. We had about 800 members of the high school canteen. And then at that time there were 400 each, approximately, at Adams and at Hillcrest. And they started on their campus, and then the Adams kids moved to Perry Park to have their canteen events. And we still kept, I think Hillcrest came down to the canteen on the high school campus.
Now, do you remember any interesting bands that they may have had at the time that eventually became famous? Or
no, I just remember Evan Zhang as being one of the people in the band, and he was one of the first people that had to go to Pacific Shores, because he had long hair. He was a straight A, he was a 4.0 student, but because he didn't conform with the dress code, he went to Shores. And that was because he had a contract with a recording company. And of course the front cover on the record showed him with long hair, so that was what he couldn't cut his hair and then be in the band. And as far as the band's name, I left that to the kids. I'm an old-fashioned Glenn Miller person, so any of those weren't really important to me.
Now, you mentioned the Strand Theater.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a little bit about, I know that people probably didn't go out as much as they do now, but can you tell me a little bit about the Strand and the Fox Theaters and any other entertainment venues that you might have taken your children to?
Well, not the movies so much, because we were all different ages. And if you have kids that age, right, some of them go somewhere and some someplace else. My bigger kids went to the Fox, and they remember that. And of course sitting in the balcony and smooching a little bit probably. But I went to the Strand, and my remembrance of some of that is how proud Fred Arnold was, who was the former city clerk, because he started as an usher at the Strand very long ago when he had red hair. And so all of those things kind of are just bits and memories. They don't really make any sense, except to think about them right now. The other places we went lots was down on the pier to that little bitty kiddie land that had horses going around in a circle and a little bitty merry-go-round. And that was important after church to go down there.
Now, can you tell me, we've heard a little bit about the carousel and about some of the things that were there, about boats that were in some kind of a moat that you could drive. Can you tell us a little bit about where it was in relation to today's pier?
Okay.
And what was there?
Well, the Hippodrome was where the carousel was, and the carousel was a sister carousel to the one in Santa Monica. And the horses were carved by a family named Looff, Looff. And I'm a real fan of carousel horses from county fairs back home, I think, but I still just love them. And it was located on the pier where Cattleman's was, and sort of where Kincaid's is now. And it was something that many people in Redondo remember riding, and I'm not sure of their age because it wasn't there when I came. I just know about it and know that it must have been a very special place. And once I had an opportunity to go into the Santa Monica carousel when there was a conference, and it was open to just the conference and not everybody. So I was so pleased to see the real loof horses. And it was a very special time, I think. And there were carousels all up and down the coast. We weren't the only one.
So what else was there when you did get here that you would take the kids to? You said after church you would go?
We went down to the kiddie park there, and then we went up on the hill to Palos Verdes to watch the horses up there. I had a family who really loved to see the horses and ride the horses. And then there was there were animals over on the corner of, let's say Spencer and Anza. That was one of the few places that still had animals that were close enough to drive to after church. And then, as I say, up in PV by the general store, where we'd go up there. That and the Dominator. We'd go to the Dominator after church on Sunday, see how much more it had sunk. And that was the old Greek freighter that sunk off the coast and had wheat that finally just rotted, I guess, probably, and either fed a lot of fish or contaminated them. So those were the special things to do.
Now, at some point, working with the Parks and Recreation Department, you became a supervisor. I believe that was from 1962 to 1967.
Mm-hmm.
What did you do as a Parks and Rec supervisor? What were your responsibilities?
All the playgrounds, all of the sports programs. At the time, the senior citizens programs, which Bob Dean was in charge of, the Canteen with Janet Huffman. Everything, I kind of fit in the role of everything somebody else doesn't want to do. I'll do it and learn how, because that's how I survived. So the playgrounds the program was tremendous. I mean, we had so many kids playing games and sports and anything you could think of, from flag football to baseball to softball, basketball, little kids, big kids, half court, that we had to winnow it down to have special tournaments and special times on weekends. During the week, it was just intramural. On the weekend, we had some eliminations. All of the young men who worked on the playgrounds they really liked to see the sports and to see the kids develop and make names for themselves, as you've heard before. But it was very rewarding.
Now, do you think there's any programs like that today that you know of?
Oh, not in that scope. I don't think so. I think they're pretty minimal. And you have to pay for them, and you have to have certain equipment, and you have to have so much insurance, and you have to not be able to pick them up and take them home from the event in your car. I mean, it was so much closer then, and so you drop the little kid off after flag football practice with his mom and dad in the front yard. I mean, you just take him home on your way home. And everything was pretty easy if you think about it.
So it was a simpler life.
Very simple.
There was not so much problems with litigation and worrying about being sued, well, either as a city or as the recreation department.
I don't think litigation was even a word we all knew. Litigious community is different. So
in about 1967, you became a community services assistant to the city manager.
Right.
What was that job?
That, again, was whoever didn't want to do it, I got it. So I worked with drug programs, with senior programs, not the fun senior programs, but people who really needed some extra help. Anyone who came in the door and wanted special service that the city wasn't providing, I would try to see that it was somewhere and they could be guided there. There were little kind of side programs that someone needed some money to make a payment on their car and they didn't have the money. They came to me, and at the risk of being a target, I formed a little account out at the credit union that was separate apart from anything the city had, and I had friends who would donate to that, and I could see that they made payments. I could go down and pay someone for gas down in the Riviera and then send this person down with a voucher so that I wasn't involved, so that I didn't become the person everybody came to, but they did anyhow. So those were the kind of things that happened, and I sat out there in the hallway and absorbed everything that was going on to be helpful, and I've always been pretty good with names and voices and all of that, so it was really helpful to the council members and to the city manager.
So in 1956, when you first came to Redondo Beach, did you ever have to go to City Hall?
No.
Now, do you remember the old City Hall? Or would you...
Just barely, because we'd go there to count money after the canteen. Lieutenant Seidel was there, and he would meet us, and we would count the money and turn it over to him.
And do you remember where the streets? I think
it was on Bonita. It was on Bonita, near the. There was a bus station there in Catalina. There's the bus station. There was a Ford agency, which the rec offices were in at that time, and the post office. But that old City Hall, I was just in the back door where the police department was, because it had police, fire, library, city council meetings, and the administrative offices.
So everything was in one building?
Yeah, pretty much.
And what do you remember about the downtown at that time when you first got here?
I thought it was awful. It wasn't like any downtown I'd ever seen. And I thought, why am I here? Of course, I grew to love it, but at the time, very small buildings. We parked in front of what somebody told us at the time was a skating rink, and it was. It had been the Mandarin Ballroom and the Pavilion and several other kinds of things, and it was downtown Redondo Beach, and I was just a little bit disoriented. But I learned to really like some of the things, like the old candy store and the big, beautiful mahogany bar that was in the candy store, and the tiled floors and the little ice cream chairs, and it was back in history, but I was back in history too. So
where was that candy store? We've never heard anything about that.
Oh, really? It was on Catalina, or Old Pacific. I guess it was on Pacific. And it was one of my favorite places. We'd walk down from Garnet, and it was near there. I won't say it was there, because my memory doesn't give me all that good stuff. And then, of course, City Hall, of course, was down along the front, too, in the old Bank of America building. And at one point in time, I can remember meeting John Renke there, because his street lighting and traffic control department was there, down in the bottom off Wall Street or Coral Way, or one of those long-gone streets.
So what made downtown, in the heart of the city, that came about around 2002 to, well, actually a little bit earlier, 2001 maybe to 2004, people talked about how much they wanted to get downtown like there used to be. This is a different perspective. If it was a little bit awful, what made it awful?
Well, it had its phases, because in its heyday, when it was the Paseo, and there were all the games, and there were all the casinos, and there was dancing for 500 couples, there were picnics on the pier, there was gambling in the casinos and gambling on the wrecks, and I think that that's what a lot of people think, is they would have liked to have had that restored as something wonderful, and it would have been wonderful. And I think if the hotel had not had to be torn down and sold,
Hotel
Redondo, because it lost its glimmer, let alone its glow, due to prohibition, and so it didn't even live very long. It only lived about 26, 27 years. And they tore it down, and I wish for it every day, and I think there are many other Redondo people who do. Then it became, in the 20s, it became a little town, like other 20s towns. And during Depression, there were just small stores, and then it had its resurgent and became the only place where we could shop, and but not broad enough that you could get everything. Dunlap's was the big department store in the Triangle. And then after that, the city did try to get some entrepreneurial money to develop the downtown, but it wasn't there. About 1976, when everybody was celebrating the bicentennial, and there was federal funds to recreate some of the old towns and some of the old buildings, was anybody really excited about, say, returning it to how it was? And the how it was depends on how old you are. So it was just so different from me. I wouldn't say it was really awful. It was just awful to me.
Sure. You came from a Midwest town.
Midwest town. And
now, what can you tell us about the Triangle? The Triangle, for people today, is roughly where the
Crown Plaza
is. And it's Pacific. There's Pacific Avenue on the back side. There's North Harbor Drive on another side, and Burl on the other side. So what was in the Triangle, and what did people do there?
Well, there was a big drugstore on the corner, which kept washing out with storms, or washing through with storms. There was the grocery store. What was the grocery store's name? Anyhow, you could walk through it. You could enter the back and go out the front or whatever to be on the beach, and there were a lot of little mom and pop stuff on the beach at that time, which little by little went away.
Now, if you could explain that, because today people that would go there in 2005 would see a retaining wall with Samba's restaurant, which used to be hard to remember, but going through, there's parking lot in between. So the water actually came across Harbor Drive during the storm.
During the storms,
and
right.
What was the beach like there?
Well, it had little stores on it. It had houses on it for a long time, but little by little in the storms of, I think, the 15s and the 20s, those washed out. And when I came here, I can remember one little mom-and-pop hot dog place that was kind of across from the Owl drugstore, that was it, and Dunlap's. And that was a place where everybody loved to go because it was kind of old-fashioned, I guess. And you could walk right up to it. You didn't have to wait in line or be seated or any of those things. And there were little places to eat. There was a lapidary shop in the Triangle. It just sort of went away finally. More recently, I think there was a store where you could buy raffia furniture and bamboo furniture, and it just slowly went down, lack of repair in the parking lot until they, and I think D&D Drug was there at that time. So.
Now, I remember in the early 80s, there was actually an antique mall.
Right. I bought lots of things there.
The antique mall was where the walk-through store was.
Right. That was Mayfair Grocery. It takes me a little while.
And Uncle Roy's was, was on the left-hand side if you're walking east through the store. Uncle Roy's was, I think, on the left, and then the antique mall was on the right. That it was one of those antique malls where you could walk through and buy things on consignment.
It was one of the first ones that had little niches and little cubby holes where people had their own stuff or they were on consignment. So that was a whole brand new thing for us. And you asked a while ago, where did we go to shop for clothes? I can remember that mostly at Christmas time or Easter, if we wanted something special, we went to Crenshaw. And what cross street, I don't know, but Crenshaw, there was a Broadway's. And that was the big city to us as far as going to a department store.
I think it was Crenshaw and Stalker.
Yeah, you're right. That's the area, but that's where we went. And I thought, oh my goodness, it took us a long time to get there. Then after there was a Broadway in Westchester, we all went to Westchester. And eventually, of course, the South Bay Galleria and all of those came along, but South Bay Center, came first.
Right, the South Bay Center was an open air collection of buildings with one or two anchor stores. I think what's now Robinson's May, now Macy's. Right. Before that was May Company. And
there was a drugstore where some of the counters in the museum were donated by Bill Reckner and Joyce Foley after that closed. just totally different. And of course, that was the rise in the north part of Redondo when they put in sewers and streets and Freeman Avenue and aerospace and all of those kinds of things came in with quite a lot of synergy, I think is the best word, from city people, private enterprise, government entities. It was a good happening. Probably never will happen again as easily as it seemed to me, because it seemed like all these men, and they were all men at the time, got together and they planned what they needed there and then saw that it happened. And it didn't take that long.
Now, in 1956, when you first got here, and let's take it through the 60s, how much contact did you have with North Redondo Beach, and what did you know about it?
Only through the recreation department. Nothing.
So with the recreation department, I have a question. I'm not sure if this predated the time when you were associated, but do you remember a toy loan program out at
yes.
Ferry Park?
That was started by the Dianas. And I can't remember the lady I worked with first, but then Mabel Crane took it over. But that was where little kids from all over the city could go there and borrow a toy, like a library book. They could borrow a tricycle, and many of them didn't have tricycles at home, but they had a tricycle for a whole month, sometimes for a week, because the demand was high. And so they would have that and little pull toys, and they would come and the toy loan lady would read to them, and that was started originally by Virginia Kurtz, who worked at the water company for a long time, lived on Avenue B, and she was with the Dianas, and amazingly enough, the Dianas started a lot of those things. And the Dianas was a group of young women with small children who volunteered their time, didn't have jobs out of.
Now I'm going to ask you a couple of questions about it. So
Go ahead.
So I don't forget, I'm going to say, I want you to tell me a little bit about the Dianas and how they got their name, and then a little bit more about that. But I'd also want to remember to ask you about how you disinfected the toys at the toy shop, if you remember. So can you tell us a little bit about the Dianas first?
The Dianas, as I said, was a junior women's club. It was a junior branch of the Women's Club.
Which today is at Broadway and
Which
Pearl.
is at Broadway at Pearl, in a building that is on the historic registry. And we had our meetings there forever and ever. When I joined, there were about 120 members. Then a lot of us went to work as the time went on, and it lost its fervor because it lost its membership. But, I'm not really sure about the name. I would be guessing without checking.
If you had a guess, is it from the Greek goddess Diana?
Of course. We were all Greek goddesses at the time. But we had wonderful Christmas parties, and everybody brought their little kids. And to this day, they look at one of my sons, at Carl, and say, "Oh, I remember you when you had on little gray flannel pants and red suede saddle shoes." And we all remember about each other's little kids, and it was just such a great family kind of thing to do.
Now, did they meet at the women's
Yes, we
club?
met there. Mm-hmm.
Now,
And
what would be considered a young woman in the Dianas?
if you were 35, you were too old to be in Diana's.
And then you kind of graduated to the
Then you
women's
could
club?
go into the women's club, but by that time, many of us had found other interests. So,
Now, can you tell us a little bit about the disinfecting of the toys at the toy shop? Do you know anything about that?
I just remember with Lysol and spraying Lysol on it, and then using tea towels to wipe them all off. I don't remember anything more than that.
But, well, that's important because one of the people that we interviewed said that her one memory was the Lysol smell when you walked into the room.
That's interesting. Yeah, that's what it smelled like. Yeah, but they were all on their little shelves, all clean for the next one. And they had a well baby clinic there too. The county came out and did little examinations for well babies, probably some of the first preventive health that was around. And everybody would bring their babies in. If they hadn't had their shots, they would arrange for them to have shots. And that was all staffed by volunteers.
Now, what do you remember? I know that we'll get to this later in the interview, but you've been involved with Beach City's Health District and with some of the hospital programs that have been here, but what do you remember about polio and the polio scare during the 50s? Because I think that was an important issue with swimming pools. It was an important issue probably with the toys and the Lysol.
And it was. And what I remember, again, is volunteers standing there with all of the things that they put on your tongue.
The sugar cubes.
The sugar cubes for the polio. And there were lines and lines of children with their parents. And they thought it was going to hurt, and of course it didn't hurt. But we were part of all of that.
And where did that happen?
High school, at the high school.
Now, do you remember children in Redondo Beach with polio?
No, but I did have a cousin who died of polio in the 40s. Was in the big...
In the iron lung?
In the iron lung, and so it really hit home. So when somebody said, would you volunteer for this? Why, you gathered up everybody, every neighbor to go down and volunteer. And
what you remember as a young mother, where would you have to go to the doctors if you wanted to go to a doctor in Redondo Beach? Did they have... did you have? I'm sure we've heard a lot about local doctors because many of them participated in city council. There were names of people that we heard that were both physicians and in city council. Yeah,
like the mayor, Russell Shea, J. Russell Shea, the one I forgot last time, and Schaefer, Dr. Schaefer out on Artesia, and then there were several in the Riviera area. So that's where we went. The hospital, of course, was not there at that time, so two of them...
Hospital, you're talking about South Bay Hospital.
I'm talking about South Bay Hospital, which came along 50 years ago, but wasn't available when I moved here, and two of my sons were born in Torrance, and then Sarah was born in South Bay Hospital because it was there by 62, and then my oldest grandson was one of the last babies born at South Bay before they shut down the
now South Bay
OBGYN.
South Bay Hospital in 2005 is the Beach City's Health District property, which is between Burl and Diamond on Prospect.
On Prospect, right.
And was there... today people look at a 3 or 4 story building. Was the original hospital different from that?
It was 3 stories, but it wasn't that big, and it didn't have the office wings. And it was pretty basic as far as the style of a hospital. It was a building, and for years and years and years, even up to maybe 2000, everybody wanted to know what the big white building was on the hill because we didn't have any kind of logo or identification up high enough that people knew what it was. So that's an improvement. And now, the hospital district is a whole nother chapter in how it wasn't used and how other hospitals, there were 3 hospitals that doctors were using, and they were on all 3 staffs. And by being on all 3 staffs, sometimes it was easier to just stay in one hospital than to go to all 3. So the referrals to South Bay Hospital got fewer and fewer until in 1998 there was only a census of about 16 people in the beds, and you can't run a hospital that way.
We're going to take a break.
Okay.